Yeah, let me pick up that one. It's interesting because we have a special position as Netherlands Kingdom in Cuba. In the how many of you do remember seeing Fidel Castro first in a non-military suit? Yeah, no one raised his hand. I saw a hand somewhere over there. How many of you know that the one who put him in a normal suit was a Dutch stylist? Right. Now she knows it because she knows her. In fact, what happened in the early 60s, when the embargo started, Cuba needed to export its nickel. And they didn't manage to get the nickel out of the country. And then a Dutch businessman was approached. If there are questions, I can tell you the full story. I'm not certain he would like it, but okay. He went around and managed to sell in short notice 2 ships that were floating and no one dared to intervene in favor of Cuba, and he did. It was his daughter who put Fidel for the first time in a civil suit. But from that came other Dutch investments. And moreover, we had in that period a fruitful dialogue with Cuba. Jan Pronk had been minister for many years. We gave development cooperation that stopped in the 80s, early 90s. But we always had an ongoing dialogue. And then came the black years I talked about in the mid-90s, and the European Union, after Cuba coming down heavily on dissidents, on people who wanted to express their opinion. I don't like very much the word dissident. On people who thought that they had the right, as we think, of freedom of speech. They clamped down hard on them, and Europe closed for Cuba. And we got a totally strained relationship that was based on only one thing. Our attitude not towards Cuba as a whole, but bringing it, narrowing it down to the classical human rights, which are critically important for Europe and for our constitution, yes. But the social human rights were more or less put aside. And in fact, everything was made 100% conditional upon Cuba first becoming a democracy before we wanted to talk again to them. Now, that's very smart when you do it, but not smart if you keep it. And what happened was that Cuba started to open up, right? And then you have to choose what you want. Do you want to stand by a country that changes and help it change not only in the economy but also in all the other aspects of freedom? Or do you want to stay aloof and talk to them at a distance? Well, the Americans couldn't do it at 140 kilometers distance. Why do we think that we could do it from 7,000? And it didn't work. So we decided, well, that is not a very smart policy, and Minister Timmermans broke the ban against the will of many other European ministers and countries, and he said, I prefer to talk with instead of talking about somebody. So in January 2014, Minister Timmermans came to Cuba and said, let's dialogue. We signed half a year before. We brought in, I just had started a year before. As ambassador, we brought in our Director General Political Affairs. That was forbidden as well, and we signed a memorandum of understanding. Well, it's funny because many countries in fact did it, but didn't make publicity about it. Because everyone knows that if you have a position and if it changes and the country changes, nothing works. Now, what happened? Timmermans broke it open. And we had a good relationship before. We are the 5th as the European part. We are the 5th trade partner and investment partner of Cuba. We don't shout it on the roofs. The Americans are listening as well. We invest there. We don't want to know too much about it, but we are. And if you take into consideration the fact that much of the oil products from Venezuela cross through our Caribbean kingdom to Cuba, that's $1.5 billion more. It brings us probably to the 3rd, if not the 2nd trade position with Cuba. Now, the oil issue and Venezuela are unstable factors in my readout, but overall, that is a very strong position. And Cuba has decided recently to prioritize 10 to 12 countries worldwide for their for the intensification of their trade relations and investment relations, and Netherlands is amongst those. And in fact, we have an extremely good working relationship, amongst others, and I might say particularly in the transport sector, and in the tourist sector, and in the health sector, a few of sectors that are critically important. So, here we are. Cuba has a potential that's been largely gone down the drain, but they have 11 million highly educated people. There are, for every 200 persons, a doctor. That's a world record. They have 80,000 outside the country. That's a world record, of course, as well. By the way, the Americans have a law that any Cuban doctor trained in Cuba with money of the state, that goes to the state, gets automatically an authorization. They try to get them out. That's from the past. That's weakening an economy. But Cuba still produces an enormous amount of medical stuff. So the country is opening up. Investment is coming in. The interest is heavy. There's a new investment law that's highly attractive for the Mariel area. Personally, the information I have is that the Nicaragua channel will come as well, and China is looking clearly to the hub function of Cuba. And in my opinion, this is not going to stop. Now, what does it mean for tourism in St. Martin? Well, you know that better than I do. Essentially speaking, we see that everybody is coming in. Trinidad and Tobago, not exactly a competitor for cruise tourism or tourism in general for St. Martin or Curaçao or Aruba, Bonaire. But they signed weeks after the 17th of December 2014 a tourism deal with Cuba. They moved very fast. From their perspective, if you can't join them, if you can't beat them, join them. St. Martin has exceptionally good quality in anything that deals with cruises. The port is Little Jewel, right? And it is, and that's critically important, it is a country from the Caribbean. Cubans, and we've seen it when Prime Minister Ushers came, we've seen it when Minister Oduber of Tourism of Aruba came 2.5 months ago. We accompanied him through our embassy. We took all the meetings that were necessary. We saw that there's immediate warmth when countries from the Caribbean come to Cuba. And if the Netherlands as a kingdom has a privileged position, then normally our Caribbean kingdom countries have it in an even reinforced manner. If you go to Cuba. Now, you don't go to Cuba for hit and run. It doesn't work. If you go to Cuba, you go to build trust first. The first time you come, your heart will see you. The second time, they notice that you're coming back. The third time, they think it's interesting, we should put them into contact with others. That can be accelerated now that we're a privileged trade and investment partner, of course. And Cubans are really, at this moment, starting to look out. Now, take care. They're overloaded with missions. One minister comes, one minister goes. And there's limited staff to do everything. One of the reasons why the negotiations with the United States are not always easy and why reactions from the Cuban side particularly drag on is because they have limited men-women power. And that is not easy to increase. So you see that still, every time the same person, you'll meet him to do 20,000 different jobs. It sounds like St. Martin, isn't it? It sounds like our embassy, so that's nice. By the way, we are growing a little bit, we're getting reinforced because in the Netherlands as well, my ministry has noticed that there's more and more work we are doing. And they know very well that we are actively promoting the exchange with the Caribbean countries of the kingdom. So, the message is in fact very simple. Are we certain that the Cuban awakening and all those cruise ships that are running now to Cuba to see if they can move in, and you can easily go for a whole week down the southern coast only and then hit into Montego Bay and go back, and people will be diverted and amused the whole trip. And in 1 year time, Cuba will have changed, and in 2 years time, it will have changed more, so it will remain adding attractivity to what you already knew. That is a challenge to any tourist destination in the Caribbean. It would be idiot not to think it would. Now, of course, cruise tourism is in growth. So you can say it won't hurt me. It might not in the short term. But the medium short term, not even talking about medium term, it's not that difficult to imagine that a fast growing tourist destination like Cuba will in the end have a diverting effect. So, what do you need? Multi-destination, talk, advice, and get your share of it. That is absolutely not impossible, but it is difficult if you move in last in line. So what definitely is needed is that you move into action. Maybe that everything I'm saying now will not happen. That advice, and the port picked it up immediately, and others picked it up immediately, is take advantage of the fact that we are in a privileged seat with Cuba, that you as a Caribbean country are in an even more privileged seat, and make good use of it, and be there while it's starting to awake, and not when you have to line behind all the others in 1 or 2 years' time. And I would like to stop here, ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister and Ministers, because I would like also to see questions coming in.
10 years ago, we signed together as Chamber of Commerce, and I'm happy to see the now Minister of Justice and my director, who were at the Chamber of Commerce, and he was the Lieutenant Governor back then, that as Vice President of the Chamber of Commerce here in St. Martin, we signed over 40 disciplines from education, health, fishery, with the Cámara de Comercio of Cuba. If you go back into the economic reports of Cuba, you would see my name there. And what the question is now, if those agreements that were signed back then, chamber to chamber, can we revisit those not being behind of everybody else, but since that is already sitting there, can we relive that?
By the way, we are building a special facility in the embassy for businessmen from the kingdom that want to operate in Cuba and that discover that in their hotel there's no internet and the telephone doesn't work. So we're going to give you a lot of things, including a warm welcome, accompaniment, helping you to get appointments. You can use the mail and you get our coffee, which is your coffee. So that anyway, that we're going to do now. Back to the question. If we get relevant information, we can test it. The Chamber of Commerce is limited in its capacity. And I'm not certain that they can find back what they received 10 years ago. But we can present them what they ought to have, at least. It definitely is an interesting starting point, because many others won't have that kind of things signed. But then you have to make up your mind. What would you like to activate under the present conditions? And we can imagine that there are sectors for cooperation between St. Martin and Cuba that would be a priority. I can think of course, when we talk about tourism, it's self-evident. If we talk about health, for example, I can imagine quite a few answers there. If you want to get sports, if you want to get trainers. Now, I understood now that no of you almost play baseball. Now, that's a shame. I throw a little ball every now and then with my custodians. And then I come from Haarlem, and Haarlem is a baseball city. But in many fields, Cubans are willing to go for exchange. And we definitely promote it. 2 years ago, when the relations were still under change, we got questions from the ministry, from our ministry, asking the embassy, can we authorize trainers from Cuba in sports or culture to go to Saba or to go to Bonaire? We told them, guys, don't even ask the question, send them. So there are many ways in which we can help. But a priority setting has to be done by the government and, in your case, by the Chamber of Commerce. That's in your hands. We are the go-betweens. We stick out a neck whenever needed. We have a broad network of contacts. We will spread it further if needed. We will accompany you if needed. But you tell us what to do.
What is the nature of the agreement with Trinidad in the tourism area?
I've tried to lay our hand on it, and we haven't had it yet. But we are looking for it. I don't know if you've seen one of them. Yeah, But the specific tourism one, you haven't seen it, I think. You've seen the global one that just encompasses everything and therefore nothing. No, but there's a specific one on tourism. I see that. I got it right. Now, but it is specifically tourism. And other countries, including from the Kingdom, are working on the same issue. No one wants to lag behind. A very pertinent and very right question. Now, the investment law of last year gives some additional protection. The issue still remains that under Cuban law, you don't refer to an international arbitration mechanism. You refer to Cuban arbitration. Now, the question, however, links into something else. Cuba, over the past few years, has started to arrange its debts, and it's punctual on paying. It has arranged that with private banks. It's punctual in its payment, one of them being Dutch. I know that perfectly well. They have longer delays in payment, but what they agree, they pay. Why? Because they can't allow to default anymore. Now, what is behind it about getting arbitration in your favor or disfavor? Essentially speaking, the positive element here is that the Cubans are acutely aware that not acting in a correct way is going to stop many investors from coming. And they need, in their calculations, a minimum of $2 billion of investment per year. They're far away from it yet. They also know that if they are an unreliable partner nowadays, and don't forget what I said, they can't fail again. This is a generation that's fading out, and the inheritance won't be there if they don't get that economy going. And the whole structure, the whole overall of the economic system points into that direction. So if they don't act correctly when it comes to justice, they are damaging the possibility of growth. Now, growth has gone up from less than 1% last year to 4% this year already. That's the immediate impact, essentially speaking, but not only of tourism. So the question is, there are somewhat better mechanisms than before. There's a limit to it built into the investment law, but there's also a question of attitude. Now, of course, there are other examples, like Canadian businessmen that have been jailed and that got out with major difficulties. By the way, there was also one Dutchman. We got him out without too many problems because he wasn't really an actor. But Cuban justice has strange habits to some extent, in the sense that a foreigner that's in a process can't leave the country unless the outcome is known. Well, that can last 2 years. That's pretty ugly. However, it's like anything else at this moment in Cuba. They're on a learning curve. And in this case, and that's in line with all the developments, the past is no guarantee for the future. And this time in the positive sense. The tendency is away from what you describe. The symptoms are still here and there present. And what happened with those businessmen, well, I don't want to pronounce myself too much about it, because it's sometimes, right, okay, you know what I mean. But overall, the tendency is on the right track, not on the bad track. Is it enough? Well, there are at this moment, I believe, 250 Italian companies, 400 Brazilian, Spaniards, numerous, they're all coming in. If you look to the number of businessmen that have had this kind of problems, it's extremely limited. So you almost also must put it into the broader perspective of what's been happening. Right? And I can give you a few cases of other countries that are good democracies where you can lose money and not get it back and feel that you're not well treated. I won't do it, including European part of the Netherlands. So it is not the question is absolutely right. I have no final answer to it, but overall, I estimated the risks are on the downside and not on the upside.
Could we, as citizens of the kingdom, buy in Cuba in bulk to export it out to the Dutch part of the kingdom?
In principle, yes. The problem is, but we know there are considerations regarding change that as well. And as I say, President Obama gave the Cubans in that respect what I would call a stinker. Until now, you can import and export into Cuba, but you have to pass through state organizations, quite many, that do the import and export in this or that sector. However, what President Obama presented is private sector can buy in the field of construction and agriculture, machinery, whatever they need, and that means direct, not indirect. What we have seen now is that, at least on one occasion, and it kind of been a tryout, in recent months, and there are definitely other examples, we just don't know them, the import organization has functioned no longer as an import organization, but as a clearinghouse mechanism, financial clearinghouse mechanism, to allow a private cooperative to import I think it was for the restaurant sector, to import directly from the state. So that again, we see that the change is there, but we don't know exactly when, how far. And that's one of the characteristics of change in Cuba. Very often things are under preparation, under the surface, and you only see it once it pops up and out. So yes, it is possible, but the whole issue of imports and exports, in my conviction, will look differently between now and 12 to 24 months. And of course you have another question. If you want to import agricultural produce, don't forget that Cuba these days, it was a major exporter of agricultural products until 1959. It now is barely capable of feeding 2 million people because they need to import $2 billion worth of foodstuff. But there's a counter side to it. The fastest growing sector almost in the economy now is the private agriculture. And they move into added value stuff, not the food staple stuff. The 8 products like frijoles, like beans for the whole public. So they move into sectors like fruit, where they can make good money. And the prices have been freed on many products, and they are allowed to sell private producers directly to the hotel sector. And they have taken most of the profits. But there's a limit. Once the hotel sector is saturated, you still need to get your product out. And that's where I think you will see change coming fast, simply because they need a hard currency, and then we're talking exports. Now, that's a guess, but it's a calculated guess.
Are the Cubans really ready to go with the growth you just described?
Oh, I think that, oh, absolutely. If you look at it, don't forget, there are a few elements you need to take into consideration. One, you have a highly educated population, and we see what's happening now.
But you said that most of them left already.
No. There's an increase. There are 50 to 60,000 Cubans moving out at this moment on a yearly basis only to the United States. I'm not talking about the fact that the Spaniards just gave in the last move 200 or 300,000 Cubans a Spanish passport. Now, these days, Spain is not a prime destination if you're looking for a job, so they're probably not moving, but there is a clear brain drain. But there are 11 million well-educated Cubans, and what we do see, let me take one example. The container port of Mariel. One of the first observations of the Australian director of the port for the Port of Singapore was, I've never seen such motivated, hardworking and smart collaborators as my Cuban collaborators, whom I'm allowed to pay a higher salary than the $20, they get 200, 300, which is a major salary in Cuba these days. And they work like hell, and they're smart. And that is one of the issues. I talk to people who are in cuenta propista business, in private business, they work like hell. Restaurants are just opening everywhere, and they work hard, and they're inventive. We had a 2-star Michelin television chief, Ron Blau. Maybe some of you have eaten in one of his restaurants in Amsterdam, maybe even in the Ajax Arena, he has one there. He came to Cuba for the week of the Puros, the Siggers. He did a gala dinner for 600 persons. He trained for 1 week the personnel of the Parque Central Hotel, nice hotel. But he went around the city We accompanied him on one of his nights. And he came back to the Netherlands and he said, I have been eating in restaurants where I get 2-star Michelin food. And he then made a little cookbook that he presented to the President of the Netherlands summer last year. So Cubans, when they get the freedom to move, move. And that's interesting. So the potential is definitely there. And as soon as they get the freedom, they move. Do they get the credit? Do the banks give them credit? Well, the banks now give credit and they make lots of noise. You know what the credit is? $400. That's a poor man's credit still, right? So are we going to see change in that area? Once again, it's almost inevitable that it will happen. And that's about growth potential.
Well, Ambassador, I really want to thank you for your presentation this evening. I think looking at the turnout that we have this evening, we can conclude that this has been a successful evening. I am very happy with the faces I see in the crowd. The questions from Ricardo I expected. And I really want to thank you. This is part of the government to share information. When the ambassador was coming, he offered, we asked, and he offered immediately to talk about the situation in Cuba. And I must say, we have, what, 3 or 4 groups already that had bilateral meetings with the ambassador from St. Martin, and that will be traveling to Cuba very soon. The other 2 countries in the Caribbean have been there. St. Martin will be moving direction to Cuba to make a visit and to strengthen our relationship in the Caribbean and also be a recognizable part of the kingdom in the Caribbean area. I want to make a little momentous for you this evening, and we hope that when you get back, it would get a appropriate place on your desk or on the wall so you can remember St. Martin. Okay.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Yeah. This is by our local artist, a painting by Ruby Butte.
I love it. My wife is going to be jealous to see it in my office, not at home. That's,
I think you should. Well, thanks again. The ambassador will be staying a couple of days more on the island to enjoy, get some rest and recreation after working 2 hard days. And we want to thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.